Joining us this evening, a policy director and economist for the CTU, the Council of Trade Unions. It is Craig Renney. Craig, good afternoon when I talk to you. Good evening when we broadcast this.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Yeah, very well. It's lovely to finally catch up and have a bit of a chat. Love to talk to you about some conversation had this morning, which we've just looked at in the show, but have some conversation this morning with Mr. Luxon on breakfast. But before we do that, because we never managed to actually connect other than texting each other prior to the election, many people who watch and listen to us want to send their congratulations to you guys for what you were putting out there. And we also want to send you guys a lot of frustrations because, 10 days before the election, having the CTU announce that only 3,000 households would get that $250 a fortnight when Labor didn't do those numbers on day one was incredibly frustrating. So you were basically doing Labor and the Greens' job by pointing this out, something that they should have done on day one. So we want to say thanks to you guys for doing that kind of stuff, and get your thoughts around why do you think that it was you guys doing God's work, for want of a better word, bringing that stuff out, and not even the parties opposing National and ACT were doing it?
Well, I think that, sorry, my computer's making a noise. The challenge there is that actually the numbers came really late for everyone. So it wasn't just that we had some special access to some special numbers. The National Party put out its fiscal plan really late. It put out its tax plans really late. And as a consequence, there wasn't actually anything for anyone to work with in the real world in a really short sense. So there was a real challenge there in being able to access those numbers. And then two, I have the luxury, being the economist for the CTU, of time. So I have the ability to spend a lot of time looking at these numbers, looking at what it means for workers and workforces. And that's a really rare and quite privileged position. So I don't want to criticize too much because I've worked in the Beehive, I've worked in opposition. I know how time pressed everybody is. And so, it's a rare luxury that I have to be able to spend some time looking at those numbers and dragging out the kinds of results that we saw just before the election. My annoyance is that actually the National Party didn't put out those numbers long in advance for everyone to see and for everyone to be able to make those calculations and to have a much more honest conversation about how things were going to get paid for and who won and who lost during the election campaign.
Yeah, we were so frustrated because, like, on day one, we were yelling from the rooftops, people, they're saying up to. And like 2 weeks before the election, RNZ did their big Media Watch expose on the media is now turning on National because they've been saying up to all the way through. And it's like, dudes, they said this on day one. What are you doing, media? What are you? Because like we didn't get any access. We're a small group when it comes to it. I mean, we do all right, but we're small when it comes to it. And the media dropped the ball, and I don't know. It just feels like the CTU were the only ones that were onto it when it came to actually analysing those things and getting them to the public. Because then you saw, Christopher Hipkins citing your numbers, which I'm just like, it just felt frustrating.
And it's intensely frustrating, but to me, it signals more of an opportunity for us to challenge this in a structural way. So we actually need a fiscal institution which is common overseas to actually do these kinds of policies and to make this kind of analysis, so that everyone can see what the impact of that is. Otherwise, we're always going to be playing catch up, and you're always going to be relying upon people like me turning up and occasionally doing the numbers, and that's actually not helpful for anyone. If we do this properly, everyone does this, and we don't end up having fights about fiscal holes or fights about who wins and who loses. We can actually concentrate on policy and actually, is something a good idea or a bad idea? And that to me is a far better use of time than trying to work out, is this calculator right or is this somebody else's calculator right?
We did find it also kind of hilarious, just a tangent for a second. I think you came on one morning right before Nicola Willis, and Nicola Willis was like, just so people are aware, this man is running adverts against us, and we want to make that. And it's just like what we said that night was, it's funny how they never speak up, like when the taxpayers union comes out against, makes policy announcements against the Labor Party, but she seemed very put out that you'd had a chance to speak that morning before her, and it I think personally it kind of showed an amount of weakness to have to kind of go, hey, warning people, when it's like, it's exactly what the taxpayers union do for the other side.
It's when they're attacking you as a human being, it's the greatest compliment that they can pay. because essentially they're not arguing about with the numbers. They're not arguing about the analysis. They're not arguing about anything else. They're saying, I'm a bad person because I once worked in the Beehive. Well, Nicola Willis once worked in the Beehive as the advisor to John Key. Does that make her a bad person? No, of course it doesn't. It's the only defense you have left.
I'll remember that the next time I'm looking at my Twitter feed, Craig. That it's a compliment when they attack you personally. But you're right. As soon as they go lefty, and that's their argument, you're like, well, at least come at me with facts, and then we can have a debate. Yeah. So very good. All right, listen, not to hold you for too long, chitter-chattering away. Chewy and I have just watched some of those conversations that Mr. Luxon had this morning. So I'll paraphrase a few things that are from the breakfast show, because this is what I want your take on, because you were pointing a lot of these out in the public media pre-election. Christopher Luxon has come out very clearly saying, and this is a quote, as we talked about during the campaign when it came to tax cuts, it will be, quote, as we talked about during the campaign. But we're pressed by Anna Burns-Francis if it would be funded as was promised in the campaign, he would not commit to that. Now, I think you pointed out, we used some of your information. We had our own thoughts as well that said very clearly the foreign buyers ban didn't look potentially feasible to fund it. But it seems now Nationalists still, even though we've figured out obviously that, ACT doesn't want to do tax cuts because at least they're being honest pre-election and saying the books are worse. New Zealand First doesn't want to do foreign buyers ban, yet Nationalists still sticking with this line. It will be, quote, as we talked about during the campaign, meaning people will get their tax cuts, but at the moment is completely not now using as a defence. Well, that's a conversation for behind closed doors about how they're going to fund it. What are your initial thoughts on this, what he's putting out in the public, Mr. Luxon, that is at the moment, and also how this is going to impact this coalition that's being made at the moment?
Well, certainly the analysis that we did prior to the election showed that it was a very difficult path to deliver the kinds of revenue that was necessary to deliver the tax cuts that were promised. And the revenue that's in front of them, in fact, I'm probably the saddest person in New Zealand because I actually have a copy of their tax plan directly in front of me. Nice. And as a consequence, the $2.958 billion that was due from the foreign buyers tax, it's a nonsense number. And that's not just me. There's a range of economists who believe that's a nonsense number. But even then, removing that, because it's frankly inconceivable that NZ First will allow foreign buyers back into the domestic residential market. It's an anathema to their entire economic philosophy. The selling of New Zealand to overseas interests. So if you remove that, there's $3 billion from a $14.6 billion program that's just disappeared. Then you add in some other changes. So, for example, they want to remove a whole suite of programs around regional development. New Zealand First campaigns on provincial development. And so there's probably a couple of $1 billion there. You talk about the need to remove all of the climate change funding. I can see the three parties coalescing around that, but then not coalescing what to do with the savings, because many of them will want to then spend that on other forms of development activity or other things, and as a consequence, that money is then not spare. Roughly speaking, you end up with about half of the amount of money necessary to deliver the full tax package. Using that as an assumption, that therefore means that because just the indexation part, just the part about adjusting tax brackets for inflation, is, according to the National Party, again, in their tax document, is $8.985 billion across the forecast period. That therefore means that if you just paid for that, which they don't have enough money to do, but if you just paid for that, you've lost the ECE program. You've lost the tax credit changes. You've lost all the welfare changes. You've lost things like the app tax removals, which was the GST on Airbnb and Uber and others. You've lost the bright line adjustments. You've lost the other things. And as a consequence, you can't deliver the package. So it's a really hard road to row. You may well end up seeing taxes delivered, but delivered later. So it doesn't cost the money up front. You may well see them trying to scramble alternative ways of financing that. And I have no insight as to what the negotiations are, but there are a range of other taxes, be they windfall taxes, be they other forms of taxes that could be put on the table. But it's going to require a lot of political and economic imagination to deliver the tax package as is written here, because right now those parties seem deeply unlikely to be able to deliver that, as Christopher Luxon said today.
The other thing is, in the conversation this morning, and I think I got this as a direct quote, if not, I'm paraphrasing accurately, Mr. Luxon said that outcomes is what matters most to New Zealanders. And I thought, well, actually, to be honest, he often talks about outcomes. If, for example, they had to change their model and they absolutely decimated the public sector with cuts, but the outcome was tax cuts, that's actually not what we want, I don't think. I don't think we want to give up, a public sector or something within our education system or our health system just for low income earners to get $10 a week. So he has been pushing outcomes for 18 months. But when he says that and you go, but what are we giving up for those outcomes? It could be a very different story.
Well, certainly a well-run, well-funded education system is a good outcome for New Zealand.
Yeah.
A well-run, publicly funded, free at the point of access public health system is a good outcome for New Zealand. $2.3 billion in landlord tax cuts is a marginal outcome for New Zealand, benefiting around 100,000 people. And those 100,000 people have done pretty well over the past couple of decades in terms of rent and capital gains. So if you're looking at outcomes and you're prioritizing which outcomes to do first, I would personally prioritize the outcomes that deliver a more productive, a more sustainable, and a more inclusive economy. And they're not tax cuts for Uber. They're tax cuts for low and middle income earners, if you really want to do that. But they're then funded by reducing inequality, by wealth taxes, by capital gains taxes, by other forms of taxes. They're increasing the rates of welfare payments so that if you unfortunately find yourself in that state, you're not reduced to a state of penury as a consequence. They're making sure that we're not continuing to pay some of the most exorbitant rents in the Western world for some pretty substandard housing in many places. There are plenty of good outcomes that we want to achieve. Many of them aren't achieved by a tax cut. And so I would argue that Mr. Luxon, if he's concentrating on outcomes, would look through the politics of that and actually look at the real outcomes New Zealanders want.
The last thing that I'll ask you about, and it's maybe more of a commentary thing, maybe more of a policy part rather than an economist part, is the frustration that we all have with all politicians, what they say before the election, post what they say after the election. I mean, he literally said this morning, well, we've all made comments before the election, like they don't matter anymore. The wealth tax is an interesting one you measure. I don't think anyone has told Mr. Luxon that having wealthy or people of means pay for prescriptions whilst community service holders and gold card holders get them for free, and then using that money to pay for new cancer treatments is akin to a wealth tax, because those that can pay, and then they use that money for other services, but he's against wealth taxes. It's just become so frustrating.
I thought it was a really interesting comment this morning from Mr. Luxon, and again, I'm paraphrasing, so if I get it wrong, slightly wrong, forgive me, but it was, he said, we have to make choices. We have to make difficult choices because we don't have infinite amounts of money in New Zealand, which is fair. So therefore, I'm happy to put the $5 charge on the prescription fee because we need better outcomes in other areas. And I was like, well, hang on a second. It's not that binary choice. There are plenty of other things that you're doing inside the tax system, inside your spending decisions. And so, for example, one of the spending decisions is spending a large amount of money extra on corrections and on essentially imprisoning a large number of new people.
Yep.
There are some real choices here about what you want to do with your money. And I would rather imprison a few people less and rehabilitate people properly and use that as a proper mechanism and pay for prescription fees rather than just simply deciding that you can't afford this when all the evidence tells us giving people access to free medicine reduces the costs to the public health system in the long run and improves people's quality of life in the long run.
It's the literal fence at the top of the cliff rather than the ambulance. It's the literal, and we could address that within our justice system as well. They put that same money into the fence rather than the ambulance. In a generation, it would make a massive difference.
And that's why I said before the election that this wasn't the party of Bill English anymore.
Yeah.
Because Bill English would have looked at that calculation and said, hang on a second, I'm losing money in the long run. And a social investment approach, a true social investment approach, would have said, you make that free, you benefit everyone. And actually, the Crown makes savings in the long run.
Yeah. Bill English or Jim Bolger coming out
Sure.
over the weekend talking about that treaty referendum being bloody stupid if it was to go ahead. Now, I know that's not national, but should national allow it, also not the party of Jim Bolger either. Hey, Craig, thank you for joining us so much. Craig Renney is from the CTU as a policy analyst and also an economist. So good to talk to you, finally catching up. Great to have you on, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.